Now that we explored the Redux basics, it's time to dive deeper. In this course section, we're going to dig a bit deeper into Redux, and we're going to explore some advanced concepts, specifically how we can handle asynchronous tasks with Redux, so sending HTTP requests and similar tasks. Then also where to put our code, and it will become clearer what I mean by that as we progress through the module. And we're going to take a look at the Redux dev tools, how we can use those, and why they're awesome. Now let's start with looking at asynchronous code and side effects in general, even if they should be synchronous, even if the code should be synchronous, and Redux. Because there is one super important rule. Your reducer functions must be pure, side effect free, and synchronous. So your reducer functions should take some input, in the case of the Redux reducer, the old state and the action, and then produce some output. And that's, by the way, not just the case for Redux reducer function. The reducer function you pass to use reducer, this React hook, works in the same way. It has nothing to do with Redux, but it's this general reducer concept that you have a pure side effect synchronous function that takes input and produces some output. And for the same input, for the same values, it will always produce the same output, without any side effects that happen along the way, without any asynchronous code that blocks it. No code of that kind must be part of your reducer functions. But of course, that brings up one important question. When working with Redux, when we dispatch some action that would involve a side effect, like a HTTP request that should be sent, where should we then put that side effect code? Where should we put our asynchronous code when working with Redux? Because the reducer function is clearly the wrong place, as we just learned. The answer to this question is that we have two possible places where we can put our side effects. We can put our side effect, possibly asynchronous code, directly into the component with useEffect, for example. So just as we did it before in this course. And then we only dispatch an action once that side effect is done. So Redux doesn't know anything about that side effect. Or, and that will be new, we write our own action creator functions. So we don't use the automatically generated ones Redux Toolkit gives us, but instead we write our own action creators. And it turns out that for those action creators, Redux actually has a solution that allows us to perform side effects and run asynchronous tasks as part of these action creators, without changing the reducer function, because that function must stay side effect free. Now we're going to have a look at both approaches in this course section, and to have a look at that, we are going to start by setting up another React Redux application. We are going to do that in the next 2 lectures, and you can therefore skip those 2 lectures if you don't want to repeat what you learned in the last course section, though I of course recommend that you don't. But we are going to repeat that, build a basic React Redux application in the next 2 lectures, and thereafter we're going to explore asynchronous code and Redux and all these shiny new things. Now, I got another starting project for you, to which we're now going to add Redux and some logic. And that will then be the project which we use in the next lecture to add some side effects and some asynchronous code. But before we do that, we need to add Redux. Because the starting project I give you has a couple of React components. And if you run npm install to install all dependencies, and thereafter npm start to start the development server, you will see this application here, this dummy application, which is not interactive. Clicking those buttons won't do anything. This is just dummy data. Now in this lecture, we are going to make sure that those buttons do something. And to be precise, I want to ensure that if we click the My Card button, We toggle this cart, so we show it, and if it is already showing up, we hide it. I want to make sure that if we click Add to Cart on a product, we do add it to the cart. And if it's already part of the cart, we just increase the quantity of the existing item. You can also add more dummy products for that, so that you have more products to choose from. And in the cart, with these buttons, plus and minus, we also want to control the quantity. And if the quantity is 1 and we click minus, we remove the item entirely from the cart. Now that's the logic we're going to add in this lecture. And as I said in the last lecture, this also is a great practice for you. Try implementing all those features which I described, including that toggle mode for the cart with Redux. Potentially with multiple state slices if you want. Here is a pause for you to pause the video and try it on your own. Thereafter, we're going to implement it together, step by step, practicing what we learned. Were you successful? Let's implement this together. And for this, let's set up Redux in this application. Now for this, I'll first of all quit the dev server and then install @redux.js toolkit to install the Redux toolkit because I still want to use that. You could also use just Redux and just React Redux, but working with Redux toolkit simply makes working with Redux much easier. Now, one thing I forgot, of course, is that we still need to install React Redux though. So you should also install React Redux in addition to the toolkit. Now, once both is installed, we can start setting up our Redux logic and connecting it to the React app. For this, in the source folder, I'll add a store folder. Again, it doesn't have to be named store, but it is a common convention. And in that store folder, I want to add my index.js file, which will set up my Redux store and so on. And I also want to create multiple slices, one slice for managing the cart, and one slice for user interface logic, like toggling the cart, which should go into its own slice here. And therefore, I will create two files here, a UI slice JS file, and then also my cart-slice.js file. That's not a must-do. You could put it all into one code file, but splitting it up ensures that all the code stays maintainable and manageable, and we don't end up with super large code files. Now let's maybe get started with the UI slice, so that when we click my cart, we do toggle that cart area here. For this, in the UI slice.js file, I'll import something from @redux.js toolkit. And that something, as you learned, is the createSlice function, which does what the name implies. When we call it, it creates a slice. And you learned that it needs an object for configuration where we give this slice a unique name. And here I'll choose UI as a name, but of course the name is up to you. Then, in addition, we want to set up some initial state. And we can create a separate constant for this, or do it here on the fly, and I'll do the latter. And my initial state is that the cart is visible property is false, let's say. Of course, you can name this property however you want. That will be the property which controls whether the cart is visible or not, as you can probably guess by its name. Then we need the reducers key, which is a map of all the reducers. Or to be precise, it's a map of methods that represent all the different cases, the different actions we want to handle with that reducer. And here I actually only need one method, let's say the toggle method, which receives the old state and where I then want to set state cart is visible to the opposite of what it was. And we can write this mutating code here because you learned that when using Redux toolkit, we are not really mutating the state, even though it looks like we do. But instead, Redux toolkit will kind of capture this code and use another third-party library, Immer, to ensure that this is actually translated to some immutable code, which creates a new state object instead of manipulating the existing one. And that is our slice. Now I'll store it in a constant, UI slice, and then export this as a default here. And actually, that's not all I want to export. I also want to export the actions. So I'll create a new constant which I export, the UI actions, which we get by accessing uislice.actions. Now with that exported, in index.js, we want to create our store. And we do that by importing configure store from @redux.js toolkit. And then we call configure store here. And configure store then wants an object where we set up our root reducer. Now that can be a single reducer function or a map of reducers. And I'll go for the latter, even though at the moment we only have a single reducer because we only have one slice. But since we'll later have another slice, I'll set this to a map immediately and add a key of UI, though that is up to you. But I'll name it UI, and then add an import where I import the UI slice from /UI slice, and therefore as a value for UI, I point at UI slice reducer. So the reducer created by UI slice. Now that gives us our store here, and therefore we can export this store. Like this. With the store exported, we need to provide it to the application for it to have an effect. And we can do this in the index.js file, where we set up our root component, where we render our root application component. There we can import provider, the provider component from React Redux, and wrap that around app. So wrap provider around app, like this, and provide our store. Now for that, of course, we also need to import our store. So I'll import store from /store index. So from that index.js file, and set the store prop of provider equal to that imported store. That's how we provide our Redux store to the entire application. So to all components that make up our application. And with that provided, we can now utilize Redux inside of these different components. So for example, in the layout component, in the layout folder, in the main header component there, we got this card button. This card button, which when clicked, should show the card area. Now to make that work, we actually need to go to that card button component, which we find in the card folder. And then here we have our button. Now on that button, we now want to add an on-click listener to make sure that we can do something when it's clicked. And I'll add a new function in the card button component, the toggle card handler function, where I want to dispatch the logic for toggling the card, so for showing or hiding the card. And for this, of course, we need to dispatch an action which triggers this toggle method in our UI slice reducers map. So in this reducer functions map, to be precise. And we can do this with help of the UI actions which we are exporting. In card button, we can import UI actions as a named import because we export it as a named export. Import it from, and then going up a level and another level, diving into store, UI slice. From there, I import the actions, and in toggle card handler, we can then dispatch our action. For this, I'll bind toggle card handler to the click, and to dispatch, we need access to the dispatch function. Now we do get access to that by importing the use dispatch hook from React Redux, as you learned. We can execute this hook in our component function, and when we do so, this will give us access to the dispatch function provided by Redux. And we can now use this dispatch function here inside of toggle card handler, and then simply dispatch the action which is created by the UI actions toggle action creator. We need to execute toggle as a method here because as you learned in the last course section, these auto-generated actions which you get here are actually action creator methods which you have to execute, and when you execute them, they return action objects. So it's then this returned action object which we dispatch here. And with that, we should trigger toggle cart handler whenever we click on the button. Now at the moment, of course, if we have a look at UI slice, we are then changing cart is visible, but we're not taking advantage of that right now. That's something we need to do, and for this we should go to the app component because that is where we render the cart. And I now want to render it conditionally based on that UI slice state value. So for that, inside of app component, we need to extract data from Redux. And we do that with another hook, which we import from React Redux. It's the use selector hook, as you learned. We can import use selector and then execute that in our app component function, use selector like this, not use effect. We execute this, and then you learned that to use selector, we need to pass a function which receives the Redux state automatically, because this function which we pass to use selector will be executed by React Redux. So it receives the current state automatically, and we should return the data which we want to use in this component. And in this case, that is this cart is visible property value. For this, we'll need to drill into that state slice, and since I'm setting up a map of reducers here in the index.js file in the store folder, we need to use this key to drill into that part of the state, so to say, and then use that property name in which we're interested. So here we need to access state.ui.cartIsVisible. That's how we extract that value, and then we can store this in a constant. Show cart could be the constant name. And we can now use this to conditionally show or hide this cart component like this. If we do that and save this and restart the dev server to make sure that that's up and running, we should be able, that once it is running again, that we actually click my cart to show it and hide it. So that is working, and that's the first part. Now the missing part, and arguably the more difficult part, is that we now also want to manage the content of the cart. So the cart items should be updated correctly when we click add to cart or when we click plus or minus here. And actually the badge value here in the my cart button should also be updated. So let's work on this now. For this, I'll dive into the cart slice.js file and again import create slice from Redux at Redux toolkit. Then we create a slice here and configure it with an object. It gets a name, for example, cart. It gets an initial state, and it will get some reducers. And I'll come back to the initial state in a second. Now, what is our initial state here? How should the state of this state slice look like? Which structure should this state slice have? I think it makes sense to have some items, some cart items. And that should probably be an array of items. We probably also want to have a total quantity of items in the cart. And with that, I don't mean the length of this array, but the quantity of the items of that array summed up. And initially that's 0. And the total amount is probably also something which makes sense. So the total price, which also should be 0 initially. Though for this application, we actually don't need this because we're not showing the total price anywhere. So I guess we can omit this. But you could, of course, also add it. Now we also need functions in our reducer. So different actions which this part of our state should handle in the end. And here we clearly need a add item to cart action and a remove item from cart action, I would argue. And it probably makes sense to start with adding items. So here we get a state, and we'll also accept this action argument because this action, when it is dispatched, should carry extra information. We need to know which item should be added after all. So let's dive into this add item to cart function now. What should happen in there? Well, in there, we should probably extract the item from the action, and there, keep in mind that it will be the payload property, which Redux Toolkit sets for you, which contains any extra data you added to the action. And here I assume that this extra data is another object describing the item that should be added. Now we could just push it to this array, but actually I want to check if it's part of that array already, and if it is, I want to increase the quantity of the existing cart item instead of push it as an additional item. So therefore, I want to get my existing item, let's say, by reaching out to the state items and finding an item in there where the item ID, let's assume that our items have IDs, is equal to the item ID of the item we're getting here. And since I now have a name clash, I'll name this here new item and refer to that here. So that's how I check if that item already exists. Now, if it does not exist, if existing item is falsy, so if it's not part of the array yet, then we want to add it. So then we want to go to our state items and push a new item. And that would be absolutely bad if you're using just Redux, because push manipulates the existing array in the existing state. And that's a must not do. But with Redux Toolkit, as emphasized before, we don't have that problem, because there Redux Toolkit internally ensures that this will not manipulate the existing state, but that it instead transforms this into an operation which updates the state in an immutable way. So we can use push here when working with Redux Toolkit. And then we push a new object, let's say, to our array, where we have an item ID field, which is new item.id, where we have a price field, which let's say is new item.price, expecting a price field on all our products. Then the quantity, let's say, which is 1, hard-coded, because if we add our item for the first time, the quantity will be 1. And therefore we also have a total price, which is also new item.price. It's price times quantity, but since quantity is 1, it's just the price. That could be an item which we push onto this array. Maybe we should also add the title, or the name, however you want to name it, of the product, and I expect this on new item.title. Now these field names are all up to you, because it will be your data which you manage. You just need to ensure that you then reference and create objects that have the correct structure. So with that, we're pushing a new item onto our products array. But we also need to work on the else case, so the item does exist. If that's the case, we want to update the existing item. Again, not something you should do with just Redux, but absolutely fine when working with Redux Toolkit. Then we reach out to the existing item and we update those fields on the existing item. The item ID does not need to be updated, the price also hasn't changed, but the quantity should be set to existing item quantity plus 1, and therefore we can of course also write it like this. The total price should be set equal to total price plus new item.price. So we add the price, and of course that should be existing item.total price. So we increase the existing total price by adding the item price again, and the name also hasn't changed. So we updated quantity and total price, and we're done. That's our add item to cart function here.